What if I told you that a woman collapsed at her own granddaughter's wedding, bleeding, silent, and hiding a medical condition she'd endured for 3 decades? What if I told you she'd asked for help once, 30 years ago, only to be dismissed with 6 words that changed her life forever? And what if I told you this isn't rare, it's happening right now, to women in your neighborhood, maybe even in your own family? This is Margaret's story. But before it's over, you'll realize it's also the story of countless women who've been taught that suffering in silence is somehow noble. That asking for help makes you weak. That your pain doesn't matter as much as everyone else's comfort. You're about to discover what happens when silence becomes survival, when medical neglect becomes normalized, and when one woman's courage to finally speak up changes everything. Margaret Dawson never thought she'd become famous. At 67, she was the kind of woman you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Gray hair neatly pinned, sensible shoes, the sort of grandmother who brought homemade cookies to church functions and never missed a single school play. But on a golden September morning, in front of 200 wedding guests, Margaret's carefully constructed world of silence came crashing down. She collapsed. Not dramatically, not with screams or fanfare, but the way a building falls when its foundation finally gives way, slowly, then all at once. Blood soaked through her navy dress as she crumpled onto the perfectly manicured lawn where her granddaughter Emily was supposed to be saying, "I do." The paramedics found something that would haunt everyone present for months afterward. This wasn't a sudden medical emergency. This was the result of 30 years of untreated suffering. 30 years of a woman living with a condition so severe that doctors would later wonder how she'd managed to walk, let alone function normally. And the most heartbreaking part? She'd asked for help once. In 1993, she'd walked into a doctor's office, described her symptoms, and been told in 6 simple words that would echo through 3 decades, patient advised to manage symptoms naturally. No follow-up. No further examination. No second opinion. Just a dismissal disguised as medical advice, and a woman sent home to suffer in silence. But let's start at the beginning, because Margaret's story isn't just about that day she collapsed. It's about all the days before, the quiet heroism of enduring the unendurable, the devastating cost of being unheard, and the way women learn to disappear from their own lives one painful day at a time. Picture Lancaster, Pennsylvania on a crisp October morning in 1988. The kind of morning where the air smells like wood smoke and possibility, where the maple trees paint the streets in shades of amber and rust. Margaret Dawson, then 35, stood in the bathroom of Lancaster General Hospital, staring at her reflection in the fluorescent-lit mirror. She'd just given birth to her 4th child, Laura, a tiny thing who arrived 3 weeks early and weighed barely 6 pounds. The delivery had been brutal. 18 hours of labor, complications that left Margaret torn and bleeding, stitched back together by a doctor who seemed more interested in his watch than his patient. "You'll be sore for a while," the doctor had said, not looking up from his clipboard. "4 babies will do that to you. It's normal." Normal. That word would follow Margaret for the next 3 decades like a shadow she couldn't shake. Thomas, her husband, had barely stayed for the birth. He'd spent most of those 18 hours pacing the hallway, smoking cigarettes and complaining about the hospital parking fees. When Laura finally arrived, he held her for exactly 37 seconds before handing her back to the nurse, muttering something about getting back to work. Margaret should have seen the signs then. The way Thomas looked anywhere but at her face. The way he found reasons to stay late at the office. The way their bedroom became a place of careful politeness instead of intimacy. But she was 35 years old with 4 children under 10, and survival took precedence over suspicion. The pain started 3 weeks after Laura's birth. Not the normal soreness the doctor had promised would fade, but something deeper. A pulling sensation in her pelvis, as if gravity itself had become her enemy. When she stood too long at the kitchen sink peeling potatoes, she'd feel a strange heaviness between her legs. When she lifted the laundry basket, something inside her seemed to shift and drop. At first, she told herself it was temporary. After all, she'd bounced back from her other pregnancies quickly enough. But as the weeks turned to months, the sensation grew stronger. More persistent. More impossible to ignore. She started sleeping on the floor some nights, arms spread wide, trying to relieve the pressure. She'd lie there staring at the ceiling, listening to Thomas's steady breathing beside their bed, wondering if this was what growing older felt like. If this was the price women paid for motherhood. During the day, She developed a careful choreography around her discomfort. She learned to brace herself against the counter before standing. She discovered that sitting on hard chairs was more tolerable than soft ones. She began timing her movements, calculating the cost of each bend, each reach, each step. The children never noticed. How could they? To them, she was just Mom, the person who made pancakes on Saturday mornings and read bedtime stories with all the proper voices. She was the one who kissed scraped knees and helped with homework and somehow always knew where the missing sock had wandered. She never let them see her wince when she lifted them. Never let them know that carrying baby Laura up the stairs felt like climbing a mountain with a boulder tied to her spine. She smiled through everything because that's what mothers did. They smiled and endured and pretended their bodies were infinitely strong, infinitely capable of whatever was asked of them. Thomas noticed even less than the children did. Or maybe he noticed and simply chose not to see. He was working longer hours now, coming home with the scent of someone else's perfume clinging to his shirts. Margaret found a long blonde hair on his coat collar one evening, not her color, not her length, and she brushed it away without saying a word. What was the point? Her marriage was dissolving, her body was betraying her, and she had 4 young lives depending on her to hold everything together. Confrontation felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. So she adapted. She learned to carry groceries in smaller loads. She started wearing longer skirts that would hide any signs of discomfort. She began sitting whenever possible, standing only when absolutely necessary. Her world grew smaller, more careful, more contained. And still, she said nothing. Because women like Margaret, women of her generation, women in small Pennsylvania towns, had been raised on a very specific kind of silence. You didn't talk about your body unless it was broken in ways that couldn't be hidden. You didn't complain about pain unless bones were protruding through skin. You certainly didn't burden busy doctors with vague discomforts that couldn't be easily categorized or quickly fixed. You endured. You adapted. You smiled through it. You managed. By the spring of 1989, 6 months after Laura's birth, Margaret knew something was seriously wrong. The heaviness in her pelvis had become a constant presence, like carrying a bowling ball between her legs. Some days, she could feel something bulging when she strained to lift anything heavier than a coffee cup. She'd catch herself holding her breath during simple tasks, reaching for dishes in the upper cabinet, bending to pick up toys scattered across the living room floor. Movement had become a negotiation with her own body, and increasingly, her body was winning. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in April. She was giving 3-year-old Michael a bath when she bent to retrieve his rubber duck from the bottom of the tub. As she straightened up, she felt something shift inside her, a sudden, alarming sensation like an internal landslide. She gasped, gripped the edge of the bathtub, and felt her legs nearly buckle beneath her. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might collapse right there in the bathroom with her naked toddler watching. "Mommy!" Michael's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Mommy, you okay?" She forced a smile, steadied herself against the wall, and somehow managed to finish the bath without falling over. But that night, after all 4 children were asleep and Thomas was out at another work meeting, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and made a decision. She was going to see a doctor. The appointment was scheduled for the following Thursday. Dr. Richards had been the family physician for years, a man in his late 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands who delivered 2 of her children and never made her feel rushed or dismissed. Margaret spent 3 days preparing for that appointment the way some people prepare for job interviews. She wrote down her symptoms on a piece of paper, practicing how she described the heaviness, the pressure, the strange sensation of things shifting inside her. She rehearsed in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to find words that were clinical enough to be taken seriously but not so graphic as to be embarrassing. "Doctor, I've been experiencing some discomfort in my pelvic area since my last delivery. There's a feeling of pressure, like something is dropping or falling inside me. Sometimes I can feel a bulge when I strain. It's affecting my daily activities." She said it over and over until the words felt smooth and professional, until she was confident she could present her case clearly and calmly. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling. Margaret dropped the older children at school, arranged for her neighbor to watch baby Laura, and drove to Dr. Richards' office with her practice speech ready and her hopes carefully managed. The waiting room was typical: beige walls, outdated magazines, the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with artificial air freshener. She sat in a hard plastic chair, her handwritten notes folded neatly in her purse, and tried to calm her racing heart. When her name was called, she followed the nurse down a familiar hallway to examination room 3. The same room where she'd brought the children for their checkups, where she'd received the news about each pregnancy, where she'd always felt safe and heard. Dr. Richards entered with his usual warm smile, chart in hand. "Margaret, good to see you. How are those 4 little ones keeping you busy?" She smiled back, settling into the examination chair. "They're wonderful, thank you. Actually, that's part of why I'm here today." And then she launched into her carefully prepared speech. She described the symptoms exactly as she'd practiced, using the precise language she'd rehearsed. She mentioned the heaviness, the pressure, the sensation of something dropping. She explained how it had started after Laura's birth and gradually worsened over the past 6 months. Dr. Richards listened, nodding occasionally, making notes in her chart. When she finished, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Well, Margaret," he said with the same gentle tone he'd used to explain scraped knees to her children, "what you're describing sounds like typical postpartum changes. After 4 pregnancies, your body has been through a lot. Some shifting and stretching is perfectly normal." Normal. There was that word again. "But the pressure is getting worse," Margaret pressed on, abandoning her script slightly. "Sometimes I feel like something is going to fall out of me. Is that really normal?" Dr. Richards smiled reassuringly. "Your body has been stretched and stressed by multiple pregnancies. Some looseness in the pelvic area is to be expected. What you need is time to heal and strengthen those muscles. Kegel exercises, good posture, maybe some light yoga." He scribbled something on a prescription pad and handed it to her. "Here's a pamphlet on pelvic floor exercises. Give it 6 months, and I think you'll find significant improvement." Margaret looked down at the pamphlet, a photocopied sheet with simple stick figure drawings demonstrating various stretches. "What if it doesn't improve? What if it gets worse?" "Then we'll reassess," Dr. Richards said, already moving toward the door. "But I really think time and exercise are what you need. These things usually resolve themselves naturally." And that was it. 7 minutes. A pamphlet. And 6 words that would define the next 30 years of Margaret's life. These things usually resolve themselves naturally. No physical examination. No imaging. No follow-up appointment scheduled. Just a pat on the shoulder and the gentle but firm message that what she was experiencing wasn't serious enough to warrant further investigation. Margaret drove home in a daze, the pamphlet crumpled in her purse, her carefully written notes now feeling foolish and overwrought. Maybe she had been imagining things. Maybe this was just what motherhood looked like, a series of small surrenders, tiny concessions to the demands of raising children. She tried the exercises. Every morning for 3 months, she dutifully performed the recommended stretches and Kegels. She improved her posture, wore better shoes, tried to lift things properly. She gave it time, just as Dr. Richards had suggested. The symptoms didn't improve. They got worse. By the fall of 1989, the pressure in Margaret's pelvis had become so severe that she could feel a distinct bulge when she coughed or sneezed. She started wearing 2 pairs of underwear to provide extra support. She began avoiding situations that required prolonged standing. She stopped attending church socials and PTA meetings, citing fatigue and busy schedules. But she didn't go back to the doctor. Because Dr. Richards had been kind and thorough and confident in his assessment. Because he was a respected physician who'd been practicing medicine longer than she'd been alive. Because he'd told her this was normal, and who was she to argue with normal? Most importantly, because somewhere deep down, Margaret had internalized a message that would poison the next 3 decades of her life. Her pain wasn't serious enough to deserve medical attention. Her discomfort was the price of womanhood, and complaining about it would only mark her as weak, needy, attention-seeking. So she stopped complaining. She stopped mentioning it to friends, to family, to the neighbor who sometimes asked why she looked tired. She learned to manage her symptoms the way women had always managed, quietly, privately, with a strength that went unnoticed and unappreciated. She adapted her entire life around a condition that could have been treated. She allowed her world to shrink because she'd been taught that her pain didn't matter as much as everyone else's convenience. And when Thomas left 3 years later, slipping away with his secretary like a cliché wrapped in cowardice, Margaret faced single motherhood with a body that was systematically failing her and a medical system that had already dismissed her concerns. She was 38 years old. She had 4 children under the age of 10. She had a condition that would progressively worsen over the next 3 decades. And she had been trained to believe that suffering in silence was not just expected, it was virtuous. The letter was brief. 3 sentences that dissolved 15 years of marriage like sugar in rain. Thomas was leaving. He'd found someone else. He hoped she'd understand. Margaret read it twice, standing in her kitchen with baby Laura balanced on one hip and the morning light streaming through curtains she'd sewn by hand 5 years earlier. She folded the letter neatly, placed it in the drawer with the utility bills and grocery coupons, and began making breakfast for 4 children who would wake up in an hour expecting their world to still make sense. She didn't cry. There would be time for tears later, after homework was checked and lunches were packed and bedtime stories were read. Grief was a luxury single mothers couldn't afford during daylight hours. What she did do was make a mental inventory of everything that would now fall solely on her shoulders. The mortgage payment. For sets of school clothes. Doctor visits and parent-teacher conferences. Groceries and car repairs and broken water heaters. All of it balanced on a body that felt like it was slowly collapsing from the inside out. The pressure in her pelvis had worsened significantly over the past year. What had once been an uncomfortable heaviness was now a constant presence, like carrying a brick between her legs. Some mornings, she'd wake up and need several minutes just to work up the courage to stand. The simple act of getting out of bed had become a careful negotiation with gravity. But now, with Thomas gone and no income except the part-time bookkeeping job she'd taken to help with expenses, Margaret couldn't afford to be sick. She couldn't afford to be weak. She certainly couldn't afford another doctor's visit that might result in expensive tests or treatments they couldn't pay for. So she developed new strategies for survival. She learned to carry groceries in multiple small trips instead of one large load. She discovered that wearing 2 layers of underwear provided extra support for whatever was slowly descending inside her. She began sitting down to fold laundry, to peel vegetables, to perform any task that didn't absolutely require standing. Her children adapted too, though they didn't know they were adapting to anything. They learned that Mom preferred games that could be played sitting down. They got used to her sitting on the bottom step to tie their shoes instead of kneeling. They accepted that she no longer chased them around the backyard, but she cheered enthusiastically from the porch instead. To them, she was still just Mom. Still the person who kissed scraped knees and helped with homework and somehow always managed to make Christmas magical even when money was tight. They never questioned why she moved more slowly than other mothers, why she always chose chairs over standing, why she sometimes made a soft "oh" sound when she stood up too quickly. Children are remarkably good at accepting the world as they find it. If Mom sat down a lot, well, maybe all moms sat down a lot. If Mom walked carefully up the stairs, gripping the banister with both hands, maybe that was just how stairs were supposed to be climbed. Margaret's world contracted steadily over the years. She stopped attending church functions that required long periods of standing. She declined invitations to social gatherings where she might have to sit on soft furniture that would make standing up difficult. She avoided shopping trips that would require walking for extended periods. Friends and neighbors noticed, of course, but Margaret had always been quiet, always been private. When she started declining invitations, people assumed she was dealing with the stress of single motherhood. When she seemed tired or distracted, they attributed it to financial worries. When she lost weight and looked increasingly fragile, they figured it was the natural toll of raising 4 children alone. No one asked direct questions because Margaret had perfected the art of deflection. She had a gentle smile and a soft, "I'm fine," for every concerned inquiry. She was an expert at steering conversations away from her health and towards safer topics, the children's accomplishments, neighborhood gossip, the weather. By the time her youngest started kindergarten, Margaret had been living with her condition for nearly 8 years. What had started as postpartum discomfort had evolved into something far more serious. She could now feel distinct tissue protruding from her body when she strained or coughed. Some days, the pressure was so intense she could barely walk. But she'd also become an expert at hiding it. She knew exactly which chairs provided the best support and which ones to avoid. She could time her movements to minimize discomfort, sitting down slowly, standing up carefully, never making sudden movements that might worsen the internal shifting she could feel happening. She'd learned to pack absorbent pads discreetly in her purse because the condition was now affecting her bladder control. She'd mastered the art of finding restrooms quickly and excusing herself from conversations when necessary. Most importantly, she'd trained herself to show no outward signs of pain. Her face remained calm and pleasant even when every step felt like walking on broken glass. Her voice stayed steady even when her body was screaming. This was her life now. Not the life she'd planned, not the life she'd dreamed of as a young woman walking down the aisle in her mother's wedding dress. But it was her life, and she'd learned to live it with a quiet dignity that went unnoticed by almost everyone around her. The children grew up seeing a mother who was steady, reliable, always present. They never knew that she scheduled her entire day around her body's limitations. They never realized that her preferred activities, reading together, working on puzzles, baking cookies, were chosen specifically because they could be done sitting down. As the years passed, Margaret's condition became so normalized that she stopped thinking of it as a condition at all. It was just part of who she was now, like her graying hair or her reading glasses. Something to be managed, not cured. Something to be hidden, not discussed. She'd successfully convinced herself that this was simply what aging looked like for women. That this was the price of motherhood, the inevitable consequence of childbearing. She'd forgotten that she'd once asked for help and been told it wasn't necessary. She'd internalized the message so completely that the possibility of treatment never crossed her mind again. And so Margaret Dawson disappeared, inch by inch, year by year, into the background of her own life. She became a woman defined not by her dreams or desires, but by her ability to endure silently whatever her body demanded. She became invisible even to herself. The years folded into each other like pages in a book that Margaret never had time to read. Her children grew up in the way children do, suddenly, surprisingly, leaving her blinking in wonder at how quickly small hands became capable ones, how rapidly bedtime stories transformed into curfew negotiations. Sarah, her oldest, went away to college with a scholarship and a fierce determination to study medicine. She called home every Sunday, her voice bright with stories about anatomy classes and clinical rotations. Margaret listened with pride and something else, a small, buried wish that she could tell Sarah about the body she inhabited, about the way women's pain was so often invisible, even to themselves. But the moment would pass, and Margaret would ask about Sarah's grades instead, about whether she was eating enough vegetables and getting enough sleep. Michael joined the Navy straight out of high school, seeking adventure and structure in equal measure. His letters came sporadically, filled with descriptions of places Margaret would never see and experiences she could hardly imagine. She worried about him constantly but never mentioned the way her heart raced when months passed without word, never admitted how his absence felt like a physical ache layered on top of all her other aches. Jennifer, always the artist, moved to Philadelphia to pursue graphic design. She sent photographs of her tiny apartment, her easel set up by the window, canvases covered in bold colors that made Margaret's careful, beige world seem suddenly small. She visited every few months, bringing stories of gallery openings and coffee shops that stayed open all night, energy and possibility crackling around her like electricity. And Laura, her baby who was now 25 and engaged to a sweet accountant named David, lived just 40 minutes away but existed in a world of career advancement and weekend trips to wine country that felt as foreign to Margaret as if her daughter had moved to Mars. They were good children. They called regularly, visited on holidays, worried about her in the gentle way adult children worry about aging parents. But they worried about the wrong things. They worried that she was lonely in the big house. They worried that she wasn't eating enough, that she was losing weight. They worried about her finances, about whether she needed help with repairs or groceries or medical bills. They never worried that she might be in pain because she'd never given them reason to worry about that. She'd trained them, from their earliest memories, to see her as steady and unshakable. She'd been so successful at hiding her condition that they'd grown up believing it didn't exist. And Margaret, for her part, had become so skilled at living around her limitations that she'd almost forgotten they were limitations at all. She'd arranged her entire life to accommodate a condition she no longer even thought of as a condition. Her house was a masterpiece of adaptation disguised as preference. She'd long ago moved her bedroom to the first floor, claiming she wanted to be closer to the kitchen. She'd replaced all the deep, soft chairs with firm, high-seated ones that made standing easier, telling anyone who asked that she preferred the support. She'd organized her kitchen so that everything she needed regularly was within easy reach, no bending or stretching required. She shopped in small, frequent trips rather than large weekly expeditions. She chose restaurants with hard chairs and avoided movie theaters with their plush, low seating. She'd learned to time her social activities around her body's predictable rhythms, better in the mornings, worse as the day progressed, impossible after long periods of standing. Her world had grown smaller year by year, but so gradually that the shrinkage felt natural, age-appropriate. She told herself she was simply becoming more selective, more thoughtful about how she spent her time and energy. The truth was, Margaret's condition had progressed from uncomfortable to debilitating, but so slowly and steadily that she'd adjusted to each new limitation as it appeared. She was like a frog in water that's heated so gradually the frog never realizes it's being boiled alive. By her 60th birthday, Margaret required 2 or 3 absorbent pads daily. She'd learned to carry extra underwear discreetly in her purse and to map out the location of restrooms wherever she went. She could no longer cough, sneeze, or laugh heartily without consequences she'd rather not think about. Walking more than a few blocks was impossible. Standing for longer than 10 or 15 minutes was agony. The pressure in her pelvis was now so severe that she could feel tissue protruding from her body almost constantly. Some days, the bulge was so pronounced she was afraid it would be visible through her clothing. But she'd also become an absolute master at hiding all of this. She'd learned to dress in ways that camouflaged any changes in her posture or gait. She knew which social situations to accept and which to decline. She could navigate almost any environment in ways that minimized her discomfort while appearing completely normal to outside observers. She'd become invisible in the most heartbreaking way possible. She'd made her pain so completely invisible that even she had stopped seeing it clearly. When her friends complained about their own aging bodies, creaky knees, reading glasses, the occasional bout of sciatica, Margaret would nod sympathetically and never mention that she'd been dealing with something far more serious for decades. When her children worried about her health, she'd reassure them with the same gentle firmness she'd used when they were small and afraid of thunder. She'd learned to be alone with her pain in ways that felt almost sacred, as if suffering silently was a form of devotion. As if enduring without complaint was the highest expression of feminine strength. And perhaps most tragically of all, she'd convinced herself that this was normal. That this was simply what it meant to be a woman over 60. That everyone else was just better at hiding their own struggles. She'd forgotten that she'd ever asked for help. She'd forgotten that a doctor had once dismissed her concerns with 6 casual words. She'd forgotten that there might be treatment, relief, a different way to live. She'd trained herself so completely to expect nothing that she'd stopped even wanting anything different. Until the morning Emily found the box in the attic. Emily had always been Margaret's favorite, though she'd never said so out loud. There was something about her oldest granddaughter that reminded Margaret of herself at that age. Curious, determined, unafraid to ask difficult questions. Emily was the one who'd insisted on learning to bake bread from scratch when she was 12. The one who'd written her senior thesis on women's health disparities. The one who'd chosen to have her wedding at Margaret's house because she said it felt like home in ways nowhere else did. At 28, Emily was everything Margaret had once dreamed of being. Confident, educated, financially independent, engaged to a man who treated her as an equal partner rather than a possession. She was building the kind of life Margaret hadn't even known was possible when she was that age. Which was why, when Emily found the box in the attic while searching for serving dishes for her wedding reception, Margaret felt her carefully constructed world begin to tilt. Emily had called that morning, her voice bright with excitement about final wedding preparations. "Grandma, do you remember those beautiful blue serving plates you used for Christmas dinner when I was little? I was hoping I could borrow them for the dessert table." Margaret remembered the plates, her mother's china, packed away after years of disuse because hosting dinner parties had become impossible when standing for hours of cooking and serving caused such agony. But she didn't say that. Instead, she said, "Of course, sweetheart. They're up in the attic somewhere. I think they're in one of the boxes near the window." Emily arrived an hour later with David, both of them armed with enthusiasm and dust masks. Margaret heard them moving around upstairs, their voices muffled by floorboards and decades of accumulated memories stored in cardboard boxes. She was in the kitchen, trying to decide whether she had the energy to make lunch for all of them, when she heard Emily's voice change. The excited chatter stopped. There was a long moment of silence, then David saying something too quiet for Margaret to hear. Then footsteps on the attic stairs, slower than they'd been going up. Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a folded piece of fabric. Her face was carefully neutral, but Margaret could see questions in her eyes. The same look Emily had worn as a child when she discovered something she didn't understand but suspected was important. "Grandma," Emily said gently, "I found the plates. But I also found this." She held up what she'd been carrying, and Margaret's blood turned to ice water in her veins. It was one of the cloth pads she'd made herself years ago. Hand-sewn, carefully reinforced, the kind of makeshift sanitary protection she'd been creating and using for over a decade. She'd thought she'd hidden them all, but apparently one had found its way into storage with the Christmas dishes. Margaret stared at the piece of fabric in her granddaughter's hands and felt 30 years of carefully maintained silence crumbling around her. She began, then stopped. What could she say? How could she explain something she'd never explained to anyone? Emily moved closer, her voice soft but persistent. "Grandma, what is this for? It looks like a homemade pad. But not for periods." Margaret's hands were shaking. She sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "It's nothing," she said automatically. "Just old things. You can throw it away." But Emily wasn't a child anymore, and she wasn't going to be distracted by deflection. She pulled out another chair and sat down facing Margaret, the cloth pad still in her hands. "This is sewn really carefully," Emily said, examining it. "With extra layers, and waterproof backing. This isn't nothing. This is something you made for a specific purpose." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing down on her chest. She'd been so careful, so vigilant about hiding every trace of her condition. How had she missed this one piece of evidence? Are you incontinent?" Emily asked gently. "Is that what this is for? Because if you are, there are products that can help. You don't have to make your own." The kindness in Emily's voice was almost harder to bear than judgment would have been. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at her granddaughter, this brilliant, educated, compassionate young woman who was about to discover that the grandmother she'd always admired had been living a lie for her entire life. "It's not that simple," Margaret said finally. Emily leaned forward. "Then tell me what it is. Please. I can see you're in pain sometimes, even though you try to hide it. I've seen you wince when you stand up. I've noticed how you always choose certain chairs, how you never want to walk very far. Something's wrong, isn't it?" And there it was. The question Margaret had been dreading and longing for in equal measure for 30 years. Someone had finally noticed. Someone had finally asked. "Yes," Margaret whispered. "Something's wrong." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge finally being built across an ocean of silence. Emily reached across the table and took Margaret's hands in hers. "How long?" Emily asked. Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. 30 years. Emily's intake of breath was sharp, audible. 30 years. "Grandma, what happened? Have you seen doctors? What did they say?" And then Margaret found herself telling the story she'd never told anyone. About the difficult birth, about the pain that started afterward, about the appointment with Dr. Richards and his gentle dismissal. About the pamphlet of exercises and the 6 words that had shaped 3 decades of her life. She told Emily about learning to live around the pain, about adapting her entire existence to accommodate a condition that had slowly, progressively worsened until walking to the mailbox was an achievement and standing for more than a few minutes was impossible. She talked about the incontinence, the pressure, the feeling that her body was literally falling apart from the inside out. She described the cloth pads she'd been making and washing and hiding, the careful choreography of managing symptoms while appearing normal. With each word, Margaret felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the weight of secrecy was finally being shared. Heavier because she was hearing her own story out loud for the first time and realizing how utterly abnormal it all was. When she finished, Emily was crying. Not the dramatic tears of shock, but the steady, quiet tears of heartbreak and rage. "Grandma," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't normal. What you've been dealing with isn't something you should have had to manage alone. There are treatments. There are specialists. There are surgeries that can fix this." Margaret shook her head. "I'm too old now. It's been too long." "No," Emily said firmly. "It's never too long. We're going to get you help. We're going to find out exactly what's wrong and what can be done about it. You don't have to live like this anymore." For the first time in 30 years, Margaret allowed herself to consider the possibility that her pain might not be permanent, that her limitations might not be inevitable, that asking for help might not be selfish or weak or pointless. "I'm scared," she admitted. Emily squeezed her hands tighter. "I know. But you're not doing this alone anymore. We're going to figure this out together." And in that moment, sitting in her kitchen with afternoon sunlight streaming through the curtains and her granddaughter's hands warm around hers, Margaret Dawson began to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to reclaim her body, her health, her life. Maybe silence wasn't the only option after all. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Emily had researched urogynecologists in the area and found Dr. Lisa Carmichael, a specialist in pelvic floor disorders who came highly recommended for her work with older women. Margaret had initially resisted. 30 years of medical avoidance wasn't easy to overcome, but Emily's gentle persistence had finally worn down her defenses. "I'll drive you," Emily had said. "I'll come in with you if you want, or wait in the lobby if you'd prefer privacy. But either way, we're doing this." Margaret had agreed, though her stomach churned with anxiety for days leading up to the appointment. What if the doctor dismissed her concerns the way Dr. Richards had? What if 30 years really was too long? What if she'd waited so long that nothing could be done? But there was something else mixed in with the fear, something Margaret hadn't felt in decades. Hope. Tiny and fragile as a soap bubble, but unmistakably there. Dr. Carmichael's office was different from the sterile, intimidating medical facilities Margaret remembered. The walls were painted in soft blues and greens, hung with artwork that actually looked like something you might choose for your own home. The chairs in the waiting room were firm but comfortable, and there were tissues and water bottles available without having to ask. When Margaret's name was called, Emily squeezed her hand and said, "I'll be right here." Dr. Carmichael herself was perhaps 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an unhurried manner that immediately put Margaret at ease. She shook Margaret's hand warmly and gestured to a comfortable chair beside her desk, rather than directing her to the intimidating examination table. "Before we do any physical examination," Dr. Carmichael said, "I'd like to hear your story. Take as much time as you need." And so Margaret found herself telling her story again, but this time to someone who listened without checking a watch, who asked follow-up questions that showed she was actually hearing what Margaret was saying, who nodded with understanding rather than dismissal. When Margaret mentioned her 1993 appointment with Drive Richards, Dr. Carmichael's expression grew grave. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," she said. "What you described to him were classic symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse. It should have been thoroughly evaluated and treated then. I want you to know that your instincts were absolutely correct, something was wrong, and you deserved proper medical care." The validation hit Margaret like a physical blow. For 30 years, she'd carried a small, secret doubt that maybe she'd been overreacting, maybe she'd been weak or attention-seeking. To hear a medical professional confirm that her original concerns had been legitimate felt like being handed back a piece of herself she'd lost long ago. The physical examination that followed was thorough but gentle. Dr. Carmichael explained each step, asked permission before proceeding, and treated Margaret's body with a respect and care she'd almost forgotten was possible in medical settings. When the examination was complete, Dr. Carmichael helped Margaret sit up and met her eyes directly. "You have a complete uterine prolapse," she said. "That means your uterus has descended entirely through your vaginal canal. You also have significant cystocele and rectocele. Your bladder and rectum are also prolapsed. This is causing all the symptoms you've described, the pressure, the incontinence, the difficulty with movement." Margaret felt a strange mix of vindication and fear. Can anything be done?" Dr. Carmichael smiled. "Absolutely. This is completely treatable. We have several options, ranging from non-surgical management to complete surgical repair. Given the severity and the impact on your quality of life, I would recommend surgery, but the choice is entirely yours." "Surgery," Margaret repeated. The word felt foreign in her mouth. For 30 years, she'd lived with the assumption that her condition was permanent, unchangeable, something to be endured rather than cured. "It's a procedure called a hysterectomy with pelvic floor reconstruction," Dr. Carmichael explained. "We would remove your uterus and repair the supporting structures that have weakened over time. The recovery is significant, about 6 to 8 weeks, but the success rate is very high. Most women experience complete resolution of their symptoms. Margaret sat in silence for a long moment, processing information that felt too good to be true. "I'm 67, she said finally. "Isn't it too late for surgery at my age?" "Age alone is not a contraindication," Dr. Carmichael replied. "Your overall health is good, and the benefits of surgery far outweigh the risks in your case. The quality of life improvement can be dramatic." When Margaret emerged from the examination room 45 minutes later, Emily took one look at her face and stood up immediately. "What did she say?" Margaret's eyes were bright with tears, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of pain or frustration. They were tears of possibility. "She said I don't have to live like this anymore." The surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving Margaret time to complete pre-operative testing and prepare both physically and emotionally for the procedure. Those weeks passed in a strange suspension of time. Margaret felt simultaneously anxious about the surgery and impatient for it to arrive. Emily visited almost daily, helping Margaret prepare her house for recovery, arranging for meals and housekeeping assistance, researching everything she could about the procedure and recovery process. It felt like being cared for in ways Margaret had forgotten were possible. The night before surgery, Emily stayed over, and they sat up late talking about everything and nothing. Margaret found herself sharing stories she'd never told anyone, about the early years of her marriage, about her dreams before children, about the woman she'd been before pain became her constant companion. "Are you scared?" Emily asked as they were getting ready for bed. Margaret considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. "But I'm more excited than scared. I keep thinking about all the things I might be able to do again. Walking to the farmer's market. Standing up to cook a whole meal. Maybe even dancing at your wedding." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I would love that more than anything." The morning of surgery arrived clear and bright. Margaret woke before her alarm, feeling surprisingly calm. Emily drove her to the hospital, chattering nervously about everything except the procedure itself, and Margaret found her granddaughter's anxiety oddly comforting. It meant someone cared about the outcome. It meant she wasn't facing this alone. Dr. Carmichael appeared before the surgery, checking in one final time, answering Margaret's last-minute questions with patience and confidence. The anesthesiologist was kind and professional. The nurses treated her like a person rather than a medical case number. As Margaret was wheeled into the operating room, her last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude, not just for the surgery itself, but for Emily's curiosity, for her own courage in finally speaking up, for a medical system that had evolved enough to take women's pain seriously. For the first time in 30 years, she was allowing herself to hope for a life without constant physical limitation. The surgery took 4 hours. Emily spent that time pacing the waiting room, texting updates to family members, and researching post-operative care with the dedication of someone writing a dissertation. When Dr. Carmichael finally appeared, still in her surgical scrubs, Emily practically ran across the room to meet her. "The surgery went beautifully," Dr. Carmichael said, her smile warm and reassuring. "Everything we expected to find was there, and we were able to repair it all completely. The prolapse was even more extensive than the imaging had suggested, which explains why Margaret was experiencing such severe symptoms. But the reconstruction went perfectly." Emily felt her knees go weak with relief. "When can I see her?" "She's in recovery now. Give us about an hour to get her settled, and then you can sit with her." When Emily was finally allowed into the recovery room, Margaret was awake but groggy, connected to various monitors and 4 lines. Her face was pale but peaceful, more relaxed than Emily had seen it in years. "How do you feel?" Emily whispered, taking Margaret's hand. Margaret's voice was hoarse from the breathing tube, but her words were clear. "Different," she said. "I feel different already." Over the next few days, as Margaret recovered in the hospital, the changes became more apparent. The constant pressure that had been her companion for 3 decades was simply gone. The heaviness between her legs had vanished. For the first time in 30 years, she could lie flat on her back without discomfort. "It's going to take time for your body to remember how to move without compensating for the prolapse," Dr. Carmichael explained during her post-operative visit. "You've spent so long adjusting your posture and movement patterns that it will feel strange at first to move normally." Margaret nodded, though she was still struggling to believe that normal was even possible. She'd lived with limitation for so long that freedom of movement felt almost frightening. The physical therapy started 2 weeks after surgery. Margaret worked with a specialist who understood pelvic floor recovery, learning how to strengthen muscles that had been overstretched for decades, how to retrain her body to function without the adaptations she developed over 30 years. At first, everything felt uncertain. Margaret had to relearn how to walk without the careful, measured steps she'd used for so long. She had to practice standing up from chairs without bracing herself, bending over without fear, coughing without consequence. But gradually, incrementally, her body began to remember what it felt like to be strong. 6 weeks after surgery, Margaret stood in her kitchen and cooked a complete dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and homemade rolls, without sitting down once. She stood at the counter for over an hour, stirring and chopping and kneading, and when she was finished, she wasn't exhausted or in pain. She was exhilarated. Emily arrived for dinner to find Margaret practically glowing with accomplishment. "I cooked standing up," Margaret announced, as if she'd climbed Mount Everest. "How does it feel?" Emily asked, though the answer was written all over Margaret's face. "Like I got my body back," Margaret said simply. 8 weeks after surgery, Margaret walked to the farmer's market for the first time in 15 years. She bought fresh tomatoes and sweet corn, chatted with vendors she hadn't seen in ages, and walked the entire 6 blocks home without stopping to rest. 10 weeks after surgery, she attended her first church service in over a decade. She sang hymns while standing, sat and stood with the congregation without calculating the cost, and stayed afterward for the coffee hour she'd been avoiding for years. 12 weeks after surgery, Margaret Dawson stood up at Emily's rescheduled wedding and delivered a toast that brought tears to every eye in the room. "6 months ago," she said, her voice strong and clear, "I thought my story was over. I thought I was nothing but a collection of limitations and adaptations, that my job was to take up as little space as possible and cause as little trouble as I could manage." She paused, looking around at the faces of her family and friends, many of whom were hearing this truth for the first time. "But I learned something important recently. I learned that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I learned that accepting limitation isn't strength, it's surrender. And I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your life if you're brave enough to speak up." She raised her glass toward Emily and David. "To my granddaughter, who refused to let me disappear. And to all of us, who deserve to take up space, to be heard, to live fully in the bodies we've been given." The applause that followed wasn't just for the toast. It was for 30 years of silence finally broken. It was for a woman who'd found her voice again. It was for the radical act of refusing to suffer alone. But Margaret's story didn't end with her surgery or even with Emily's wedding. In many ways, those events were just the beginning. Because once Margaret experienced what it felt like to be heard, to be helped, to have her pain taken seriously, she couldn't stop thinking about all the other women who might be suffering the same silent endurance she'd endured for 3 decades. She started small. At her post-operative follow-up appointments, she asked Dr. Carmichael about other patients with similar conditions. She learned that pelvic organ prolapse affects up to 40% of women over 60, but that fewer than half ever seek treatment. Many, like Margaret, had been dismissed by healthcare providers. Others had never mentioned their symptoms to anyone, assuming their discomfort was normal or inevitable. "Would it be helpful," Margaret asked during one appointment, "if women could hear from someone who'd been through this? Someone who could tell them they don't have to live this way?" Dr. Carmichael's eyes lit up. "That would be incredibly valuable. We have a support group that meets monthly, but we've been looking for someone to help facilitate it. Someone who really understands what these women are going through." And so Margaret found herself, at 68 years old, in a role she'd never imagined: advocate, mentor, and living proof that it was never too late to reclaim your health and your life. The support group started with 5 women. They met in the community room at the local library, sitting in a circle of folding chairs, sharing stories they'd never told anyone. Margaret listened to variations of her own experience over and over: the gradual onset of symptoms, the adaptation and accommodation, the years of silent endurance. But she also heard stories that were different from hers. Women who'd been told they were too young for prolapse. Women whose doctors had suggested they just learn to live with it, because they were past childbearing age anyway. Women who'd been prescribed antidepressants for symptoms that were clearly physical. Women who'd been told their pain was all in their head. Margaret realized that her experience with Dr. Richards hadn't been an isolated incident of poor medical care. It was part of a systemic pattern of women's health concerns being minimized, dismissed, or ignored entirely. "We have to do something about this," she told Emily one evening as they discussed the support group. "There are too many women suffering unnecessarily. Too many doctors who don't take us seriously." Emily, who had watched her grandmother's transformation with amazement and pride, nodded thoughtfully. "What did you have in mind?" Margaret's idea was simple but revolutionary. She wanted to create a resource for women that would give them the information and confidence they needed to advocate for themselves. Not a medical website full of intimidating terminology, but a guide written by women for women, in language that was accessible and encouraging. "Something that tells them their pain matters," Margaret explained. "Something that gives them permission to keep asking for help until they get it." Emily, who worked in marketing and had connections in the publishing world, offered to help. Together, they began working on what would eventually become The Voice You Deserve, a woman's guide to speaking up about pelvic health. The book combined Margaret's personal story with practical information about pelvic floor disorders, tips for communicating with healthcare providers, and stories from other women who'd found help after years of suffering. It was part memoir, part medical guide, and part rallying cry for women to stop accepting pain as inevitable. Writing the book was therapeutic for Margaret in ways she hadn't expected. Putting her experience into words helped her process 30 years of silence and understand how profoundly it had shaped her sense of self. She wrote about the woman she'd been before the pain, the accommodations she'd made along the way, and the person she was becoming now that her body was her own again. But perhaps most importantly, she wrote about the cost of silence. Not just the physical cost, but the emotional and spiritual cost of making yourself small, of disappearing from your own life, of accepting less than you deserved. The book was published 18 months after Margaret's surgery by a small press that specialized in women's health issues. Margaret never expected it to reach a wide audience. She'd written it primarily for the women in her support group and others like them. She was amazed when orders started pouring in from around the country. Women were buying copies for their mothers, their sisters, their friends. Book clubs were choosing it for discussion. Medical practices were recommending it to patients. Margaret started receiving letters from readers, dozens, then hundreds of them. Women who recognized their own stories in hers. Women who'd finally found the courage to seek help after reading about her experience. Women who'd been suffering in silence and thought they were alone. One letter came from a woman in Oregon who'd been living with prolapse for 15 years. She'd seen 3 different doctors, all of whom had told her it was just part of aging. After reading Margaret's book, she'd sought out a specialist and was scheduled for surgery. Another came from a young mother in Texas who'd been experiencing pelvic pain since her second child was born. Her doctor had told her to wait and see if it improved on its own. Armed with information from Margaret's book, she'd insisted on a referral to a specialist and discovered she had a significant prolapse that could be treated non-surgically if addressed promptly. The letters kept coming, each one representing a woman who'd found her voice, who'd refused to accept pain as normal, who'd insisted on proper medical care. Margaret read every single letter, often with tears in her eyes. Each one represented not just an individual success story, but a small victory against a system that had trained women to suffer in silence. 2 years after her surgery, Margaret was invited to speak at a medical conference on women's health. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of doctors, nurses, and healthcare administrators, she felt a responsibility she'd never experienced before. 30 years ago, she began, I sat in a doctor's office and described symptoms that were drastically affecting my quality of life. I was told these symptoms were normal, that they would resolve on their own, that I should simply manage them and move on with my life. She paused, making eye contact with faces throughout the audience. For 30 years, I believed that assessment. I organized my entire life around a condition that could have been treated. I made myself smaller and smaller, until I'd almost disappeared entirely from my own existence. She told them about the cloth pads she'd sewn by hand, about the careful choreography of movement she developed, about the way she'd learned to hide pain so completely that even her own family never suspected she was suffering. I'm not sharing this story to make you feel guilty, she continued. I'm sharing it because I want you to understand the real-world consequences of dismissing women's health concerns. Every time you tell a woman her pain is normal without thoroughly investigating, every time you suggest she should just learn to live with symptoms that are affecting her daily life, you're potentially condemning her to decades of unnecessary suffering. The applause that followed was subdued, thoughtful. Margaret could see that her words had hit their mark. These were good people who'd gone into medicine to help others, but they were working within a system that had historically devalued women's experiences and normalized their pain. After her presentation, several doctors approached Margaret to thank her and to share their own observations about the challenges of treating women's health issues. Some admitted that they'd probably dismissed symptoms in the past that they would investigate more thoroughly now. Others asked for copies of her book to share with patients. Dr. Carmichael, who had introduced Margaret at the conference, found her afterward. "You know," she said, "when I went into urogynecology, I thought I was just treating medical conditions. But watching your journey has reminded me that we're really treating the whole person, all the years of silence and adaptation and self-doubt that come along with the physical symptoms." Margaret nodded. "The medical part was actually the easy part," she said. "The harder part was learning to believe I deserved better. Learning to take up space again. Learning to speak up after 30 years of staying quiet." "That's exactly why stories like yours matter so much," Dr. Carmichael replied. "Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, but changing cultural attitudes about women's pain, that's much harder. That requires voices like yours." 3 years after her surgery, Margaret's life looked completely different. She was traveling for speaking engagements, corresponding with women around the world, and working on a second book about aging and self-advocacy. Her support group had grown to over 50 members and had spawned similar groups in neighboring towns. But perhaps the most profound change was in her relationship with her own body. For the first time in decades, Margaret experienced her physical self as an ally rather than an enemy. She delighted in simple pleasures she'd forgotten were possible, dancing to music on the radio while cooking, walking briskly through the park, standing up from chairs without bracing herself. She'd also developed a new relationship with her own voice. After 30 years of minimizing her needs and downplaying her pain, Margaret had learned to speak up clearly and directly about what she needed and deserved. Not just in medical settings, but in all areas of her life. When the grocery store clerk seemed impatient with her questions, she took her time anyway. When a waiter was dismissive, she asked to speak to the manager. When her insurance company tried to deny coverage for follow-up care, she appealed the decision and won. "I'm making up for lost time," she told Emily one afternoon as they walked through the farmer's market together, something they'd never been able to do before Margaret's surgery. 30 years of not speaking up. I'm probably a little overcorrecting, but it feels good to know my voice matters." Emily laughed. "I love seeing you like this. You're so much more present, more yourself." Margaret considered this. "I think I'm actually becoming myself for the first time," she said. "The person I might have been if I hadn't spent 3 decades organizing my life around pain and silence." They stopped at a vendor selling fresh flowers, and Margaret bought an enormous bouquet of sunflowers, bright, bold, impossible to ignore. "These are for no special occasion," she announced, cradling the flowers like a prize. "I'm buying them just because I want them. Because I deserve beautiful things. Because I take up space in the world and that's okay." As they walked home together, Margaret carrying her sunflowers and Emily carrying the shopping bags, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. Not because her story was over, but because she'd finally learned how to be the author of it. She thought about all the women who were reading her book, attending support groups, finding their own voices after years of silence. She thought about Emily, who was growing up in a world where women's pain was taken more seriously, where asking for help was seen as strength rather than weakness. And she thought about her younger self, the frightened 35-year-old who'd sat in Dr. Richard's office and accepted his dismissal as the final word on her suffering. If she could go back and tell that woman anything, it would be this: your instincts are correct. Your pain matters. You deserve better. And it's never too late to start over. But since she couldn't travel back in time, Margaret did the next best thing. She kept telling her story, kept encouraging other women to tell theirs, kept insisting that silence wasn't the only option. Because she'd learned something in her 68th year that she wished she'd known at 35, the most radical thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear. The most revolutionary act is speaking up when the world expects you to stay quiet. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to break your own silence, you give other women permission to break theirs too. The ripple effects of Margaret's story continued to spread in ways she never could have imagined. 5 years after her surgery, she received a call from a producer at a national television network. They wanted to feature her story in a documentary about women's health advocacy. "We're calling it The Silence Breakers," the producer explained. "Stories of women who refused to accept medical dismissal and fought for proper care. Your story keeps coming up in our research. You've inspired so many women to speak up." Margaret agreed to participate, though she was nervous about the level of exposure a television documentary would bring. She'd grown comfortable speaking to medical audiences and support groups, but national television felt overwhelming. The filming took place over 3 days, both at Margaret's home and at Dr. Carmichael's practice. Margaret was interviewed about her experience, her recovery, and her advocacy work. Emily was interviewed as well, talking about the moment she discovered her grandmother's secret and the impact it had on their relationship. But the most powerful segment was filmed at one of Margaret's support group meetings. The cameras captured women sharing their stories for the first time, finding their voices, realizing they weren't alone in their experiences. One woman, a retired teacher named Helen, broke down as she described 20 years of living with prolapse because her doctor had told her it was just something older women had to deal with. Another woman, barely 40, talked about being told she was too young for her symptoms to be serious and going without treatment for over a decade. Margaret watched these women find their courage and felt a deep sense of purpose. This was why she'd been willing to share her story, why she'd written the book, why she continued to speak publicly despite her natural inclination toward privacy. When the documentary aired 8 months later, the response was overwhelming. Margaret's story was featured prominently, interwoven with those of other women who'd fought for proper medical care. The show generated thousands of responses from viewers who recognized their own experiences in the stories being told. Margaret's publisher called to tell her that orders for her book had tripled overnight. Dr. Carmichael reported that her practice was inundated with new patient requests from women who'd been living with untreated prolapse for years. Most meaningfully to Margaret, the documentary sparked conversations between mothers and daughters, grandmothers and granddaughters, about health issues that had previously been shrouded in secrecy. Women started asking their female relatives about symptoms they'd been experiencing, sharing resources, encouraging each other to seek help. The documentary also caught the attention of researchers studying gender bias in healthcare. Margaret was invited to participate in several studies examining how women's pain is perceived and treated differently than men's pain. Her story became part of the growing body of evidence documenting systemic inequality in medical care. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the response from the medical community itself. Medical schools began incorporating Margaret's story into their curricula as an example of the long-term consequences of dismissing patients' concerns. Her experience became a case study in how implicit bias could affect patient care. Dr. Carmichael later told Margaret that she'd been contacted by colleagues around the country who wanted to learn more about recognizing and properly treating pelvic floor disorders. The documentary had highlighted how common these conditions were and how often they went undiagnosed or undertreated. Your willingness to share your story publicly has probably changed the trajectory of care for thousands of women, Dr. Carmichael said during one of Margaret's annual follow-up appointments. That's an incredible legacy. Margaret reflected on this as she drove home from the appointment. When she'd first found the courage to tell Emily about her condition, she'd never imagined it would lead to anything beyond her own treatment. She'd certainly never imagined becoming a public advocate or having her story featured in medical education. All she'd wanted was to stop hurting, to reclaim her body, to live without the constant accommodation and limitation that had defined 3 decades of her life. But in seeking help for herself, she'd inadvertently opened a door for countless other women to walk through. Her story had become permission for others to speak up, to demand better care, to refuse to accept pain as inevitable. 7 years after her surgery, Margaret received a letter that made her cry, not with sadness, but with overwhelming joy. It was from a young woman named Jessica, a medical student who'd seen the documentary and read Margaret's book. "I'm writing to tell you that your story changed the course of my career," Jessica wrote. "I was planning to specialize in cardiology, but after learning about your experience and the experiences of so many other women, I've decided to focus on women's health instead. I want to be the kind of doctor who listens to women, who takes their pain seriously, who never tells a woman to just manage her symptoms." The letter went on to describe how Jessica was working on research about improving patient-provider communication, specifically focusing on how to better hear and address women's health concerns. "I keep a copy of your book on my desk," Jessica concluded. "It reminds me every day that behind every patient is a whole human being with a story that deserves to be heard. Thank you for finding the courage to tell yours." Margaret read the letter several times, each reading bringing fresh tears. This was what Emily had meant when she'd said Margaret's story could help other women. Not just women who were currently suffering, but the next generation of healthcare providers who would treat them. That evening, Margaret called Emily to share the letter. Emily, now married and pregnant with her first child, listened with a mix of pride and protectiveness she'd felt toward her grandmother ever since that day in the attic. "You know what I love most about this?" Emily said. "It's not just that you found your voice. It's that you've taught other women they deserve to have a voice too, including women who aren't even born yet." Margaret thought about that as she sat on her porch that evening, watching the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills. Her granddaughter was right. By refusing to stay silent about her own experience, Margaret had helped create a world where Emily's future daughter would grow up knowing that her pain mattered, that her body belonged to her, that asking for help was a sign of strength rather than weakness. It had taken Margaret 67 years to learn those lessons. But maybe, with enough women telling their stories and refusing to accept dismissal, future generations would learn them much earlier. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. Not because her story was over, she was still writing it, still speaking up, still encouraging other women to find their voices. But because she'd learned that silence wasn't the only option. And in a world that had taught her to disappear, she'd chosen instead to become visible. In a system that had encouraged her to suffer alone, she'd chosen to speak up for herself and for every woman who came after her. That choice had changed everything. Not just for Margaret, but for countless women who now knew they didn't have to carry their pain in silence. 10 years after her surgery, Margaret Dawson stood before the largest audience of her life. She was the keynote speaker at the International Conference on Women's Health, addressing over 3,000 healthcare providers, researchers, and advocates from around the world. At 77, Margaret moved with confidence and grace that would have been impossible during her decades of hidden suffering. Her hair was completely silver now, her face lined with age, but her voice was strong and her presence commanding. "When I collapsed at my granddaughter's wedding 10 years ago," she began, "I thought it was the end of my story. I thought I was finally succumbing to a condition I'd managed to hide for 30 years. I thought my legacy would be silence, accommodation, and quiet endurance." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Instead, that moment of collapse became the beginning of the most important chapter of my life. Because it was the moment I stopped being invisible to myself and to the world around me. Margaret told her story once again, but this time to an international audience of people who had the power to change how women's health concerns were addressed around the globe. She talked about the systemic factors that had contributed to her decades of silence, the medical training that taught providers to normalize women's pain, the cultural messages that told women to endure rather than complain, the research gaps that left conditions like hers understudied and undertreated. But she also talked about hope. About the progress that had been made in the decades since her surgery. About the young doctors like Jessica who were entering the field with new awareness and commitment to listening to women's experiences. About the research that was finally being conducted into conditions that primarily affected women. About the support networks that were helping women find their voices and advocate for themselves. "Change is happening," Margaret said, her voice rising with passion. "But it's happening because women are refusing to stay silent. Because patients are demanding better care. Because advocates are insisting that women's pain matters as much as anyone else's pain." She concluded her speech with a challenge to the audience. "Every one of you has the power to ensure that no woman suffers in silence the way I did. Every time you truly listen to a female patient, every time you take her concerns seriously, every time you refuse to dismiss her pain as normal or inevitable, you're changing the world." The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes. Margaret stood at the podium, overwhelmed by the response, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. After the conference, Margaret was approached by dozens of healthcare providers who wanted to thank her and share how her story had influenced their practice. She was invited to consult on research projects, to contribute to medical textbooks, to serve on advisory boards for women's health organizations. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when a young nurse approached her with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother died last year," the nurse said. "She was 93 and had suffered from prolapse for over 40 years. She never told anyone in the family about it. I only found out when I was helping clean out her house and found boxes of homemade pads in her closet, just like the ones you described." The nurse paused, struggling to continue. I keep thinking about all those years she suffered alone. All the things she couldn't do, all the ways she had to limit her life. If only she'd had someone like you to show her it was okay to speak up. If only she'd known she didn't have to live that way. Margaret hugged the young woman, feeling the weight of all the women who'd suffered in silence, who'd died without ever receiving the help they needed and deserved. "Tell her story," Margaret said quietly. "Don't let her suffering be invisible. Every story matters, even the ones that end sadly. Especially those ones." That night, in her hotel room, Margaret wrote in the journal she'd kept since her surgery. For 10 years, she'd been documenting her recovery, her advocacy work, and her thoughts about the experience of finding her voice after decades of silence. "Today I spoke to 3,000 people about the importance of listening to women," she wrote. "But I couldn't stop thinking about all the women who never got the chance to speak. All the grandmothers and great-grandmothers who suffered and died without ever being heard." She paused, pen hovering over the page. "I can't save those women. But maybe, by telling my story over and over, I can save some of the women who come next. Maybe I can make sure that fewer women have to suffer the way I did, the way that young nurse's grandmother did." Margaret closed the journal and looked out the hotel window at the city lights below. Tomorrow she would fly home to Pennsylvania, back to her support group and her correspondence with women around the world and her quiet life that was no longer defined by pain and limitation. But she would carry with her the faces of the people who'd heard her story today. The doctors who'd promised to listen more carefully to their female patients. The researchers who'd committed to studying conditions that primarily affected women. The young medical students who'd asked for copies of her book. Each one represented hope. Each one represented change. Each one represented a woman who might not have to suffer in silence because Margaret had found the courage to break her own silence. And that, Margaret realized, was the greatest gift of all. Not just her own healing, but the possibility that her healing could help heal others. Not just her own voice, but the chorus of voices she'd helped create, women around the world who were speaking up, demanding better care, refusing to accept pain as inevitable. As Margaret settled into sleep that night, she thought about the letters that would be waiting for her when she returned home. Letters from women who'd found the courage to see specialists after reading her book. Letters from daughters who'd convinced their mothers to seek help. Letters from healthcare providers who'd changed their approach to treating women's health concerns. Each letter represented a life changed, a voice found, a woman who'd refused to disappear. And in the morning, Margaret would answer every single one. 15 years after her surgery, Margaret Dawson celebrated her 80th birthday surrounded by 4 generations of women. Her daughters had come from across the country. Emily was there with her 3 children, 2 daughters and a son who would grow up in a world where women's voices mattered more than they had when Margaret was young. Even some members of her support group attended, women who'd become like daughters to her over the years. As Margaret looked around the room at all these faces, some lined with age, others smooth with youth, all animated with conversation and laughter, she marveled at how different this gathering was from the quiet, careful birthday celebrations of her earlier years. Back then, she'd celebrated birthdays sitting carefully in uncomfortable chairs, managing her pain silently while trying to appear normal and cheerful. She'd deflected attention, minimized her needs, made herself as small as possible so as not to burden anyone with her limitations. Now, at 80, Margaret was unapologetically present. She moved freely around the room, hugging friends, chasing grandchildren, standing for as long as she wanted without calculating the cost. When someone asked how she was feeling, she answered honestly, sometimes tired, sometimes energetic, sometimes reflective about the remarkable journey her life had taken. Grandma, Emily's oldest daughter, now 15, approached her with a curiosity that seemed to run in their family's genes. "Mom told me about your book and everything you did to help other women. Did you really suffer for 30 years without telling anyone?" Margaret sat down beside her great-granddaughter, studying the girl's face. She saw intelligence there, and compassion, and the kind of questioning spirit that wouldn't accept easy answers. "I did," Margaret said simply. "But not because I was especially brave or strong. I suffered in silence because I'd been taught that was what women were supposed to do. I thought my pain didn't matter as much as other people's comfort." The teenager frowned. "That's ridiculous. Of course your pain mattered." Margaret smiled. "You say that now, living in a world where women's voices are more valued than they were when I was your age. But even today, women are still taught to minimize their needs, to not complain, to put everyone else first. The difference is that now we're also teaching girls like you that they deserve to be heard. What would you tell someone my age who was experiencing something like what you went through? Margaret thought carefully before answering. I would tell her that her instincts matter. That if something feels wrong in her body, she should trust that feeling and keep asking for help until she gets answers. I would tell her that asking for medical care isn't selfish or weak, it's self-respect. She paused, watching her great-granddaughter absorb these words. But most importantly, I would tell her that she doesn't have to suffer alone. That there are people who will listen, who will help, who will believe her when she says something is wrong. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the dishes were washed, Margaret sat on her porch with Emily, watching the sunset paint the Pennsylvania sky in shades of rose and gold. Are you tired? Emily asked. That was a lot of people and conversation. Margaret considered the question. She was tired, but it was the good kind of tired that came from being fully present for celebration and connection. Not the bone-deep exhaustion that had characterized her years of hidden suffering. I'm tired, she said, but I'm also grateful. 20 years ago, I couldn't have hosted a party like that. I wouldn't have had the physical energy or the emotional capacity to be so present with so many people. Emily nodded. I was thinking about that today. How different you are now from when I was growing up. Not just physically, but in every way. You take up space now. You let yourself be seen. I spent so many years making myself invisible, Margaret reflected. To doctors who didn't want to hear about my pain. To family who didn't need to be burdened with my limitations. To myself, because acknowledging what was happening felt too overwhelming. She rocked gently in her chair, the same chair where she'd sat through countless evenings of pain and silence. But invisibility is exhausting. It takes so much energy to hide who you really are, to minimize your needs, to pretend you're not suffering. I had no idea how much of myself I'd given up until I started getting it back. What do you think made the difference? Emily asked. What finally gave you the courage to speak up? Margaret smiled. You did. Your refusal to let me hide anymore. Your insistence that I deserved better. Sometimes we need someone else to see our worth before we can see it ourselves. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Margaret thought about all the women she'd met over the years through her advocacy work, women who'd found their voices because someone in their life had refused to let them suffer alone. You know what I hope? Margaret said finally. I hope that someday, stories like mine will seem impossible to young women. I hope we'll create a world where no woman has to suffer for 30 years because her pain was dismissed as normal. Emily reached over and took her grandmother's hand. I think we're getting there. Slowly, but we're getting there. Margaret squeezed her granddaughter's fingers, thinking about the young women she'd met at conferences and support groups, the medical students who were learning to listen differently, the researchers who were finally studying conditions that primarily affected women. Change is slow, she agreed. But it's happening. And every woman who finds her voice makes it a little easier for the next woman to find hers. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Margaret felt a deep sense of completion. Not because her work was finished. She still had letters to answer, speaking engagements to fulfill, women to encourage and support. But because she'd learned that the most important story she could tell was her own, honestly and completely. She'd broken the silence that had defined 3 decades of her life. She'd reclaimed her voice, her body, her sense of worth. She'd created space for other women to do the same. And in doing so, she discovered that the woman she'd thought was lost forever, the curious, vibrant person she'd been before pain taught her to disappear, had been there all along, waiting for permission to emerge. At 80 years old, Margaret Dawson was finally, fully herself. And she intended to stay that way for whatever time she had left. The last chapter of Margaret's public story unfolded 3 years later, when she was invited to deliver the commencement address at her granddaughter Emily's alma mater medical school. At 83, Margaret had officially retired from most of her advocacy work, but this invitation felt like a perfect culmination of her unexpected second career as a voice for women's health. Standing at the podium in her navy blue dress, the same color she'd worn to Emily's wedding all those years ago, though this one fit her perfectly and showed no signs of hidden suffering, Margaret looked out at 200 young doctors about to enter the profession that had both failed and ultimately saved her. "Graduates," she began, her voice still strong despite her age, "when I was 35 years old, I went to see a doctor because I was in pain. I described my symptoms clearly and accurately. I was dismissed in 6 words, patient advised to manage symptoms naturally. Those 6 words shaped the next 30 years of my life." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the audience. "I'm not telling you this to shame the medical profession. I'm telling you this because you have the power to ensure that no patient leaves your office feeling unheard, dismissed, or invisible. You have the power to be the doctor I needed but didn't have." Margaret went on to share the lessons she'd learned through her journey, about the importance of truly listening to patients, about recognizing that pain affects the whole person, not just the part that hurts, about understanding that some of the most vulnerable patients are those who've been taught not to complain. "Medicine is more than diagnosis and treatment," she concluded. "It's about seeing the humanity in every person who trusts you with their suffering. It's about believing patients when they tell you something is wrong. It's about remembering that behind every symptom is a human being with a story worth hearing." The standing ovation that followed was lengthy and heartfelt. But for Margaret, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when a young woman in her cap and gown approached her with tears streaming down her face. "My mother has been living with pelvic pain for 10 years, the new doctor said. She's seen multiple doctors who keep telling her it's stress or normal aging. After hearing your speech, I'm going to help her find a specialist who will actually listen to her." Margaret hugged the young woman tightly. "That's how change happens," she whispered. "One conversation at a time. One woman helping another find her voice." That evening, back home in Pennsylvania, Margaret sat in her kitchen with Emily and Emily's 3 children, helping them with homework and planning the weekend's activities. It was a scene that would have been impossible during her years of hidden suffering, the physical demands of active grandparenting, the emotional availability required to truly be present with children. "Grandma," Emily's youngest daughter asked, looking up from her math homework, "why did you become famous?" Margaret laughed. "I wouldn't say I'm famous, sweetheart. But I guess I became known because I learned to speak up about something that was wrong." "What was wrong?" Emily started to intervene, thinking the topic might be too complex for a 7-year-old, but Margaret held up a gentle hand. "I was sick for a long time, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought I wasn't supposed to complain. But being quiet about it didn't make me strong, it just made me suffer longer than I needed to." The little girl considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important concepts. "So speaking up made you better?" "Speaking up helped me get the help I needed to feel better," Margaret clarified. "And it helped other people who were suffering the same way know that they could get help too." "That's good," the child said with finality, returning to her math problems as if the wisdom of speaking up when something is wrong was now settled knowledge. Margaret smiled, marveling at how naturally children accepted the idea that pain deserved attention, that suffering didn't have to be endured alone. If only adults could maintain that clarity. Later that night, after the children had gone home and Emily had headed back to her own house, Margaret sat in her living room with a cup of tea and the latest batch of letters from women around the world. Even in her 80s, the correspondence continued, women sharing their stories, asking for advice, thanking her for showing them they weren't alone. She opened a letter from a woman in Sweden who had read the translated version of her book. The woman described 20 years of living with prolapse, multiple dismissive medical encounters, and finally finding proper treatment after being inspired by Margaret's story to keep searching for help. "You showed me that my pain was real and deserving of attention," the woman wrote. "You gave me permission to demand better care. Because of your courage to speak up, I found my own voice." Margaret folded the letter carefully and added it to the box where she kept all the correspondence she'd received over the years. Thousands of letters now, each one representing a woman who'd found the strength to break her own silence. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret reflected on the unexpected shape her life had taken. She'd spent 30 years invisible, accommodating, disappearing from her own story. Then, in her late 60s, she'd found her voice and discovered that using it could help others find theirs. She thought about all the women who were sleeping peacefully tonight because they'd received proper medical care instead of dismissal. All the daughters and granddaughters who were growing up knowing their pain mattered. All the healthcare providers who'd learned to listen more carefully because they'd heard her story. None of it erased the 30 years of suffering she'd endured. But it gave that suffering meaning, transformed it from senseless endurance into a foundation for change. Margaret Dawson had learned to speak up. And in doing so, she'd taught countless other women that their voices mattered too. As she drifted off to sleep in the house where she'd once hidden cloth pads in boxes and organized her life around pain, Margaret smiled. Tomorrow there would be more letters to answer, more women to encourage, more opportunities to remind the world that no one should have to suffer in silence. Her story had become bigger than her own healing. It had become a bridge for other women to cross from silence to voice, from invisible suffering to visible strength. And that was the greatest gift she could have imagined, not just finding her own way back to herself, but lighting the path for others to do the same. Margaret Dawson passed away peacefully in her sleep 4 years later, at the age of 87. She died in the same house where she'd once suffered in silence, but surrounded by evidence of a life fully lived and loudly celebrated. Her funeral was unlike any small-town Pennsylvania service anyone could remember. Women came from across the country to pay their respects, patients she'd supported, doctors whose practice had been changed by her story, researchers who'd included her experience in their studies, and hundreds of women whose lives had been transformed by reading her book or hearing her speak. Emily delivered the eulogy, standing where Margaret had once collapsed at her wedding, now speaking about a woman who'd refused to let that collapse be the end of her story. "My grandmother taught me that silence isn't golden when it costs you your life," Emily said, her voice strong and clear. "She showed me that speaking up isn't selfish, it's survival. And she proved that it's never too late to find your voice if you're brave enough to use it." After the service, women lingered in small groups, sharing their own stories of how Margaret's courage had influenced their lives. A surgeon talked about how Margaret's book had changed her approach to treating women patients. A young mother described finally getting help for postpartum complications after reading Margaret's story. An elderly woman admitted she'd lived with similar symptoms for 40 years until Margaret's advocacy gave her the words to describe what was wrong. Emily listened to these testimonials with wonder and pride, realizing that her grandmother's influence would continue long after her death. Margaret's story had become part of these women's stories, woven into their courage to speak up, their refusal to accept dismissal, their insistence on proper care. 6 months after Margaret's death, Emily received a call from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to create a film about her grandmother's legacy. The project would trace the impact of Margaret's advocacy, following some of the women whose lives had been changed by her story. "I want to call it The Silence Breaker," the filmmaker explained. "Your grandmother showed the world what's possible when one woman refuses to stay quiet. But more than that, she created a movement of women finding their voices." Emily agreed to participate, knowing that Margaret would have wanted her story to continue helping women long after she was gone. The documentary, released 2 years later, featured interviews with dozens of women whose lives had been changed by Margaret's courage to speak up. It also included footage from Margaret's final speaking engagement, a video message she'd recorded for a medical conference just months before her death. In it, she looked directly into the camera and delivered what would become her most quoted words. "I spent 30 years believing that my pain didn't matter enough to deserve attention. I was wrong. Every woman's pain matters. Every woman's voice deserves to be heard. And every woman has the right to demand the care she needs and deserves." She paused, her eyes bright with the fire that had sustained her advocacy for nearly 2 decades. "If you're watching this and you're suffering in silence, please know this: you don't have to. Your story matters. Your pain is real. And somewhere out there is a doctor who will listen, a treatment that will help, a solution that will give you back your life. Don't wait 30 years like I did. Speak up now. Your future self will thank you." The documentary ended with scenes from Margaret's life, her garden, her kitchen table where she'd answered thousands of letters, her support group meetings where women found their voices. But the final image was of Emily's daughters, now teenagers, confident and articulate young women growing up in a world where their grandmother's courage had made it easier for them to be heard. Margaret's legacy lived on in policy changes at medical schools, in research funding for women's health issues, in support groups that continued to meet using the model she'd established. But perhaps most importantly, it lived on in the countless individual moments when women found the courage to speak up because they'd heard her story. A young mother insisted on seeing a specialist when her doctor dismissed her postpartum pain. A teenager told her parents about symptoms she'd been hiding because she was embarrassed. An elderly woman asked her doctor direct questions instead of accepting vague reassurances. Each of these moments was a small victory, a life potentially saved from unnecessary suffering, a woman choosing visibility over silence. And in each of these moments, Margaret Dawson's voice echoed forward, the voice she'd found at 67, the voice she'd used to break 30 years of silence, the voice that had taught a generation of women that they didn't have to disappear from their own lives. Her story had become their permission to speak up. Her courage had become their invitation to demand better. Her refusal to stay silent had become their roadmap out of invisible suffering. Margaret had once believed she was too old, too tired, too damaged to matter. Instead, she discovered that her pain, transformed into purpose, could change the world one woman at a time. And that transformation continued, rippling outward through time and space, touching lives she'd never know about, giving voice to women she'd never meet, ensuring that fewer and fewer women would have to suffer in the kind of silence that had once defined her life. In the end, Margaret Dawson's greatest achievement wasn't surviving 30 years of hidden pain. It was teaching the world that no woman should have to. Her silence had been broken. And in its place, she'd left behind a chorus of voices, women speaking up, demanding better, refusing to disappear. That was her true legacy. Not the years she'd lost to silence, but the voices she'd helped find. And those voices would continue to echo long after her own had fallen quiet, carrying her message forward into a future where women's pain would no longer be invisible, where asking for help would no longer require courage, where no one would have to suffer alone. Margaret Dawson had spoken up, and the world had listened. Now it was everyone else's turn to speak. If Margaret's story moved you, or if it reminded you of someone you love, don't let it end here. Share this video with a woman who needs to hear that her pain matters, that her voice deserves to be heard, that it's never too late to demand the care she deserves. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that break the silence around women's health, that celebrate the courage it takes to speak up, that remind us all that no one should have to suffer alone. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay quiet. Margaret's voice may have fallen silent, but her message continues. Your pain is real. Your story matters. And you deserve to be heard. Hit that notification bell, because every story we share could be the one that saves someone from 30 years of unnecessary suffering. Every voice matters. Every story counts. And every woman deserves better than silence. Thank you for listening to Margaret's story. Now go tell yours.